Good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming to this workshop. One of the fun things about being here at Flourish is I've talked to a lot of people who are, shall we say, the entrepreneurial type. And so this workshop, we're going to talk about starting a homeschool group, some of the administrative and operational concerns for doing that. My name is Darren Jones. I'm a homeschool graduate. I married another homeschool graduate. We have 4 children. 2 of them we've graduated from homeschooling, and 2 of them are still being homeschooled. I work for a company called Homeschool Legal Defense Association, HSLDA. I've been there over 25 years, and most of my job there is talking with people just like you, group leaders, the people who want to help homeschoolers and homeschool families and homeschool parents, and maybe parents who would like to be homeschooling but can't. One of the other things you should know about me is I'm a Christian. I worship in the Anglican tradition, and if you know anything about Anglicans, we have written prayers for everything. So we're going to start off today with prayer. Would you bow with me, please? Most loving Father, you will us to give thanks for all things, to dread nothing but the loss of you, and to cast all our care on the one who cares for us. Preserve us from faithless fears and worldly anxieties, and grant that no clouds of this mortal life may hide from us the light of that love which is immortal, and which you have manifested unto us in your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. HSLDA and the Flourish Conference are committed to your success because you are the front line of helping homeschoolers. You're the leaders. Through this workshop, we want you to be informed, inspired, educated, hopefully, in this season of helping your groups. We're going to go in kind of 2 sections, some things to think about when you're starting a group, and some things to think about when your group is up and running. My email is darren@hslda.org. I'll put that up on the screen at the end. If you want a copy of these slides, just go ahead and email me. I'll be happy to send them to you. So, some things to think about in starting a group. What are some of the things? Well, we're going to start off with a couple icebreaker questions. The first one is this: what is the legal definition of homeschool? For those who think it depends on the state, can I see your hands? And for those who think that it's defined as a parent teaching her own child for a set daily time using written curriculum, good. I'm glad not many people chose that one because, like all questions that lawyers ask you, it depends. And this one, seriously, it depends on the state. So for you guys then, when you are deciding to start up a group, what's the legal definition of a homeschool co-op? Well, it depends on the state, but all states require parental involvement. Can I see your hands on that one? All right, so that's one choice. And then the other is, there is no legal definition. Well, I kind of lied on the last question. The answer to all questions that lawyers ask you is not necessarily it depends. In this case, there is not one single state that defines what a homeschool co-op is. And in fact, a lot of my job when I'm talking with people who want to start a homeschool co-op involves asking them, what do you mean by that? Forget the names, just tell me what you want to do. So as you're thinking about starting a group, you're going to want a purpose for your group, and there are lots of different kinds of groups. You might be a religious group. You might be totally inclusive. You might be a large group. I routinely talk with large homeschool co-ops who have 600 families in them. Or you might be 2 families getting together at the park every other Friday. You might be an in-person group. You might be virtual. You might be a combination of those 2. Maybe you're a very formal homeschool group, or maybe you're just kind of some families hanging out together. There's homeschool groups that operate on a state level. Check out the table here at Flourish for the Georgia Home Educators Association, which is a state organization that HSLDA works with. You might be a local group. You might be a regional one. I've talked with one entrepreneur here who has a homeschool business that has students from all across the country. So there are lots of different kind of groups, but no matter what kind you are, you need to think about putting your purpose in writing. Now, for some groups that will involve a statement of faith. So take a look at this one that I've put up here. All right, so this one here is that this group wants to love and honor Christ and encourage, educate, and engage with the local homeschool community. They exist to offer support services and activities. They don't enroll students in a school, and they exercise the freedom to speak and teach about the Bible. So that's one possibility. Does that kind of give you a good idea of what this group's purpose is? All right, so there's another one here. Now this one is for a nature-based group, and they just want to provide support and encouragement. They say that they have a diverse membership. There's nothing in here about any sort of statement of faith or anything like that. You'll also want to think about the structure of your group. Again, are you just 3 families getting together every couple of weeks for your kids to play? Or are you 50 families who are getting together and doing 10 different classes every week? The bigger you get, the more important formal structure is. And so you may want to think about your leadership. Again, I've put together a couple different ones from groups that have emailed into me. If you want to see other ideas of how these groups are set up, let me know. But take a look at this one. This one describes itself as a radically inclusive, eclectic group which recognizes the universal human rights of all people, regardless of, huge list, we have a horizontal organizational model. Okay? So this is a group that's designed to not have a hierarchy. Here is a much different style. The property, business, and affairs of the association shall be managed, controlled, and directed by the board of directors. The director position is considered a leadership position reserved for persons with a biblical worldview. So again, 2 totally different groups here. They're both serving homeschoolers, but think about for your group, what kind of structure do you want? What kind of leadership do you want? You should definitely plan to have some legal guidelines, standard operating procedures. These are called bylaws. They're like a roadmap by which your organization operates. And HSLDA has several sample bylaws on our website. If you want, I can look over your group's bylaws and tell you if I see anything glaring that's missing. Now, as you're setting up your group, there may be some paperwork. And so here is a question for you. What is the root of all kinds of paperwork? Is it money, or is it operating field trips? And yes, you all know the root of all kinds of paperwork is indeed money. As soon as money starts changing hands, your group needs to start thinking about business issues. We'll start with a fairly basic one. Is your group going to be a for-profit or a nonprofit group? Now, I am more familiar with nonprofits, as I tell people all the time. I am somewhat biased towards nonprofits. After all, I work for a nonprofit. I've served on different nonprofits boards. There are workshops about how to set up a business, how to set up a nonprofit. This is not that workshop. I'm just giving basic advice. Feel free to contact me afterwards if you would like to talk more about this issue. But no matter whether you're going to be a business or a nonprofit, you're probably going to have some sort of board of leadership. You might just run it all by yourself, but usually you're going to have some people helping out. And in fact, if you are a nonprofit, you have to be run by a board. That's one of the definitions. So board members, or if you are a business, those who are in leadership for your business, they have duties to the organization. This basically means they have to put group interests at top priority. I talked with a group in Kentucky back a few years ago. They had incorporated in 2015, and they had the same treasurer for 4 years. After that, he started going through some personal difficulties, so a new treasurer was voted in, started going through the books, which is a good idea, and all of a sudden it looked like several $1,000s were missing. So the group called in the old treasurer and said, what's going on here? And at first the treasurer denied that there was any money missing at all. And then, being shown the books, he said, well, see, I wasn't feeling well the last couple of years, and so what I'd do is I would collect membership dues from people, and I'd keep it at home in an envelope for a while before taking it to the bank, and maybe some of the money went missing there. And then finally he broke down and confessed, yes, actually he had taken money from the group. So the group called me, and they were wondering what their legal obligation is, because they didn't want to sue or report to the police. Their treasurer had been embezzling. But by law, they were required to act in the best interest of the group, and that may include some of those things. Something else to think about that I've put on this slide besides duties is, how is your board going to be chosen? So sometimes you have a board, this will be set up by the person who starts up the organization. And they choose some of their friends, and some people have the same vision for the group as they do. And then, as time goes on, they add one or two more people to the board who have that same vision. This is called a self-perpetuating board. It's totally legal. The company that I work for, HSLDA, has had a self-perpetuating board since 1983. Some groups, though, want to have a lot more input, and so their board of directors is actually elected by the membership of the group. And some groups I've talked with, the board is basically whoever volunteers. There are good workshops available about how to train board members. This workshop is not that one. One last thing that I need to mention about this, as far as if you are going to have a leadership board, again, whether it's a business or whether it's a nonprofit, you need to figure out, how do you get rid of a board member who is not getting with the program? Maybe they're not showing up at meetings. Maybe it's just you have different visions of where the organization should go. So is it going to be that a majority of the board has to vote to not have this person on our board? Does it have to be a unanimous vote of everyone but that person? Or can the group itself, the members of the group, vote to remove the board member? Remember, there are lots of different kinds of homeschool groups. And in fact, that brings up the next question that I have for you here. One of my friends who works with a lot of homeschool groups said, since the pandemic, it seems that the blurry lines between homeschool groups and schools, private schools, have gotten even blurrier. True or false? Yeah, this one absolutely. Just in the last few years, there are so many different kinds of homeschool groups and private schools and hybrid schools and micro schools and homeschool co-ops that meet 5 days a week and homeschool co-ops that meet one afternoon every 2 weeks. So these are, again, things to think about as you're starting up. What kind of group are you? And that is a question that I ask a lot of groups. My advice to groups boils down to this. Figure out what kind of group you want to be, and then be that group. You'll hear me say this several more times as we go on. Now, I got a question from a state homeschool organization back a few months ago saying, it's my understanding you can't run a homeschool co-op 5 days a week. Is that correct? They had gotten a question from a group that they told me essentially they want to have a private school without the red tape of a private school. They wanted to run it as a homeschool co-op. So the real question to me is, why are you calling this group a homeschool co-op if it's operating 5 days a week? Can a homeschool co-op operate 5 days a week? Is the answer yes, or it depends on the state? And the answer here is it depends. There are some states where running a homeschool co-op, you can still say those kids are being homeschooled according to the definition of homeschooling in their state. But in a number of states, for instance, don't try this in New York or Washington. And in California, if you want to do that, well, it's fine as far as the compulsory education law goes, but you're going to have to make sure that every single one of those kids has been fully immunized if you're going to be meeting every day like that. So hopefully you can see it's important to think about issues like this when you're starting up a group. And now we're going to look at what happens when you've got that group up and going. Now you need to think about running a group. And there are some policies that I usually recommend you should at least look at as your group is running up. We'll go through each of these briefly. All right, so the first one is protecting kids in your group. If your homeschool group has any in-person events, it should have a child protection policy. And here are some of the things that you'll want to consider. Our website landing page, hslda.org/childabuse, has valuable information on it. Things about designing a policy, some good articles from therapists and counselors, things that are useful. There are also very good resources available from an organization called Bullied, Broken, and Redeemed. There's a book called Safe Haven by the Christian Law Association. It's designed more for churches, but it works well, especially for your more formal type of homeschool group. One of my personal heroes, Rachel Denhollander, who went to the same law school that I did, she has a really good book for kids on her website called How Much is a Little Girl Worth? And I've recommended to a number of groups, buy it, put it in your library. It's a good book to have around. Here are some other things you might want to consider as you put together your child protection policy. What about doing some sort of screening, a background check? I mean, many groups do background checks for their leaders, for teachers. If you're going to have a nursery, you absolutely want to make sure that you do a background check on those workers. Some groups actually require background checks for every single family who wants to join. You're not legally required to do that here in Georgia, but your members may expect it of you. And there are some states where that is actually going to be required. HSLDA has a list of organizations that conducts background checks. And if you want, just get in touch with me, email me, I can send that to you. Sometimes, by the way, the church that you meet in is going to have some policy about background checks. So if you run this background check, let's look at another question here. What do you do with the results from running this background check? Do you keep them private? Raise your hand for that one. Or do you distribute them only to paid members of the group? Well, the answer to this one is keep them private. Please. These often have very sensitive information. If you do a background check that comes back with paper results, those should be kept in a locked filing cabinet. If they are digital, they should be kept in a format that is password protected. And I often recommend to people, make sure you put in your policy that this information is kept private, because I've talked with a lot of homeschool families. They tend to be, shall we say, very privacy conscious. And so if you put in there that, yes, we know that this is getting at some sensitive information, potentially in your background, but we will keep all that information confidential, they'll be more willing to go along with it. You also might check out training. A lot of local churches do training on child abuse policies, child abuse prevention, how to protect kids at your events. Also, there's free online training from the Boy Scouts. If you have a child in Scouts, you can log on to that. As part of this training, let's look at some things that you might want to put forward as guidelines for the people who are working with your kids. So maybe these are your teachers or your coaches, your nursery workers, maybe your tutors, whatever you call them. These are the people who are working with the kids in your group. Things like only use positive verbal interactions with the kids. No intimidating or demeaning language. It shouldn't have to be said, but you should say it. No sexually oriented communications between the leaders of your group and the kids in your group. And then, of course, always appropriate physical interaction. Things like high fives are great. Fist bumps are wonderful. Having the kids come to you and sitting down and having them sit on your lap while you're giving them a big bear hug, no, not a good idea. Tickling and wrestling are fine at home with your own kids. You don't do that with the kids here at our group. Some other things you may want to think about in this policy. Your policy might have privacy concerns, like if you take pictures at your group event, do those get posted on your social media page? And maybe the parents need to approve pictures before they get put up, or just sign a blanket at the beginning of the semester that, yes, you can post pictures of my kid. You also should really look at and put in your policy the definitions for what your state says is child abuse and child neglect. Now, that's a floor, the state law. The church that you're meeting in may have something to say about that. Your group may say, well, we think this thing is neglectful even if the state doesn't. And so we're going to take action if we see this. Another thing you'll want to put into your policy is what we call too deep leadership. And this is, you always want to make sure that you have 2 adults whenever there's a function going on. If there is a class that's going on, you've got the teacher and a teacher's aide. And there are a couple reasons for this. One is that predators tend to isolate children. So a too deep leadership will protect children. And it also protects workers from false claims. You'll want to talk in your policy about monitoring. Know whose job it is in your group's leadership to make sure that the guidelines for adult-child interaction are being followed. Because unfortunately, those who prey on children tend to push the boundaries and then get a very wounded look when you come to them explaining, no, you can't do that, that's against our policies. Because they will push and push and push to see just how far they can get away with. I often recommend find someone in your leadership who likes confrontation, and then make that the person whose job it is to make sure the rules here are being followed. You'll need to know how to respond and report if something does occur. If you see evidence that a child is being abused or neglected at home, or if one of your staff or maybe one of the kids there is bullying another one, you need to know what the law is and know what your group's policy is for reporting to either Child Protective Services or the police. This is one that I'd be happy to talk with you leaders about for your group, because every state is different, so I can go through what the law in your state is, and we can determine, for example, are you a mandatory reporter, or is this something that you could report if your group says yes, or if you say yes, or, as in the case in a number of states, if you see abuse, then you are required to report it. Just everyone's a mandatory reporter. So don't get caught like the group that I talked to in Illinois. This one, a teen had come to one of the leaders in the group and said that her mom abused her. And she said that she'd already told a youth leader at church, and the group called and told me, and they said, well, we assume that the youth leader has already told the authorities what's going on here. And knowing the family, we think it's more likely it's just a teen not liking the rules at home. And besides, reporting these allegations would be detrimental to the mom's career. Well, I told them that's a red flag. Just because possible abuse has been reported to someone else does not relieve you of a legal obligation to report it. Okay, so that's the first policy that I recommend that you have as a group. Let's take a look at the next one here. And this is because any time that you are bringing money into your group, money brings issues with it. So here's a question for you. Let's say you have decided to set up as a nonprofit. Is a nonprofit allowed to offer classes and charge a fee? All right, let's see here. Does it depend on the state's definition of homeschool co-op? Or is the answer yes, absolutely you can offer classes and charge a fee? Well, the answer here is not it depends. The answer is yes, you are allowed to offer classes and charge a fee. This, by the way, is something that nonprofits do all the time. In fact, the nonprofit that I work for, HSLDA, we offer classes, we charge a fee. So, again, money brings issues. Here are some of the things that you're going to want to think of doing in your financial policy. The first one is, who has control of the funds? That's an important one, and you want to make sure that the person that has the control of those funds actually is competent and capable. But the second part of your policy, besides who controls the funds, is you've got to have someone who watches the person who controls the funds. I got a call from a group in North Carolina. Their group leader, who was responsible for collecting money and using it to buy insurance for the group and pay the co-op teachers, quit in the middle of the school year. And when she left, the new group leader couldn't find the group's insurance policy. And the more she dug, the more it looked like it had never been bought. And then when they contacted the now ex-leader, she said, "Oh, my computer crashed. I lost all the financial records." And then they started getting calls from the co-op teachers saying, "We haven't been paid in 3 months. Where's our money?" So for things like this is where you're going to want to talk to a professional, a bookkeeper, an accountant. If you have questions about your group's finance, the bottom line is contact a professional. They're out there. All right. We could talk a lot more about this one, but let's move on to the third policy. So we've done child protection. We've talked a little bit about finances. Another one that you should probably do is codes of conduct. Now, I have a lot of different examples of codes of conduct that have been adopted by various homeschool groups. If you want some ideas, email me, I'll send them to you. If you already have some ideas, get in touch. I'll be happy to talk about these with you. Here are some things that groups have done legally. You can do things like set your group's expectations for behavior in class or out of class. Now, the whole reason why I started recommending to groups they should adopt a code of conduct was because of a group that contacted me a few years ago. This one, they had a mom's night out every month where everyone would meet at someone's house and they just have a nice evening of fellowship. And after about 4 years, they went over to the home of a mom who was new to the group that year. And besides the normal snacks and Cokes, she also put out some beer and some hard liquor. And half the group was horrified that she was serving alcohol at a homeschool co-op event. And half the group was like, yes, finally, after 4 years, we get some decent drinks at a mom's night out. I laugh about it, but it actually did end up splitting the group. They split into 2 groups because they had different ideas of what acceptable conduct at a homeschool event was. So, you can set your behavior for stuff at events. You can also set your expectations for behavior at the co-op or the homeschool group itself. So my kids have actually been in a couple homeschool co-ops as they've grown up. At one of them, the kids were required to sit at desks in rows, raise their hand before being called on so they could ask a question. The other co-op didn't even have desks. It was kind of theater seating, a little community theater. And as I was teaching the class, if the kids got bored, they could just get up and leave, and the gym was right next door where they could go and play in the gym until that class was done. They could wander the hallways where there were several stations set up, where my wife, for example, had a creativity station. Come over here and work on a poem this week. Or maybe another week it was, we'll draw a picture together. Here are several different media that you can use for that. If you go to the co-op expecting that everyone will sit and raise their hand, and then it's one where kids are wandering in and out and having paper airplane fights, which happened with me because I was teaching a class on great battles, and so they were acting out some of the battles. That's great if you are expecting it, but if you're expecting something different, there could be significant problems. So just put your expectations in writing. You can, as a group, institute a dress code. Maybe that dress code is for your regular classes that you're putting on. Maybe the dress code is for special events like field trips or homeschool proms. Yeah, have fun with those dress codes, folks. Another thing that you can do with your code of conduct is set out expectations for no harassment, no bullying. Is this going to be just on-site? Are you going to have requirements for what they can do outside of co-op? For example, do you maybe have a website or a Facebook page or a Discord server where the kids can interact afterwards? The other thing that you might look at is some of these different codes of conduct, like what kind of medication can you bring, for example, or electronic devices. An example for the medication one was Oklahoma just a few years ago adopted a medical marijuana law. And one of the co-op families, the dad was able to prescribe medical marijuana. And so he started prescribing it to other parents in the co-op. They didn't have a medication policy. They quickly adopted one to make it clear what you were allowed to bring to co-op and what you were allowed to distribute at co-op. I've talked with groups who have policies on prescription medication, especially in areas that have been hit hard by the opioid crisis. You can have a policy on EpiPens. If one of your kids has severe allergies, who's allowed to carry the EpiPen and who is allowed to administer the EpiPen? And then, of course, after you set the rules, you should have some sort of enforcement policy. Is this going to be, we give a warning to the kid, we give a warning to the parent? Do we expel the kid? Do we expel the family? Is there a probation period? A lot of groups go with some sort of kind of 3 strikes and you're out, or increasing penalties as behavior goes against the codes of conduct. However, if there's a danger to another person, you do not have to go through all your 3 strikes. You are allowed to just remove the person. Let's talk about a question. What is a reasonable time? What does that mean? All right, so here's what it is. I got a contact from a group. There was a 14-year-old boy in the group who had sent a note to a girl in the group saying he was severely depressed. The girl handed it to her mother. Good start. The mother contacted the boy's mother, also a good thing. The boy's mother was on the board. She and her husband got their son counseling, but the girl's mother was saying, well, this shows that there may be some abuse or neglect. We have got to report this to the authorities because the kid was severely depressed. Which I talked with them, and according to their state law, that was actually not required to be reported, although they could. But then the group wanted to know, if the child is in counseling and we don't perceive him as any sort of threat, what would be a reasonable amount of time to allow him back into the group? And so, for you who are here, let's take a look at this one. What is a reasonable time? Is it dependent on the auguries? For those of you who are Latin fans, those were the flights of birds that the ancient Romans used to tell the future. And crystal ball readings. Or there is no real answer to this because it's at least 3 different questions. Yes, you all got this one right. Very good. My advice to them was, this isn't really something I can answer. It is a legal question. What's in the legal best interest of your group? Number 2, it's a practical question. Does his counselor think that coming back to the group is going to help him with his depression? And it's a social question. How is your group going to respond to this kid who left under sort of cloudy circumstances and is coming back? So I recommended talking to his counselor, talking to his parents, and then making a decision as a board. All right, I have another question for you here. Can a homeschool group be sued? I mean, get real, this is America. Anyone can be sued for anything, right? So the question is, yes, and it's already happened, or yes, but it's still in the future. Those who think it's already happened, yes, you are right. I'm personally aware of a few lawsuits against homeschool groups. The first big one was a group in Indiana. It was sued for a failure to accommodate a child's disability. She had a food allergy. Now, eventually the group won for reasons we'll discuss later, called public accommodation law, but the suit went all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. By that time, the group was out of business. It had spent all its money. If you want, I'd be happy to talk with you about this one later. It's actually kind of fascinating. Two other lawsuits against homeschool groups come out of Connecticut. The first one was against the Muslim Society of Greater Danbury. It had a homeschool program. That program was sued because, at least according to the parents who sued it, it didn't have a strong enough child protection policy. It didn't have a hall monitor monitoring the back staircase where an older boy caught a younger girl and bad things happened. One of the issues in the lawsuit was actually whether the program was a school, in which case it was required by law to have certain policies, or whether it was a homeschool co-op. And remember from back at the beginning, there is no legal definition of what a homeschool co-op is. That case settled with the Muslim Society having to pay out $75,000. I used to say that I had never heard of a group that had been sued because it expelled someone, but like so many things, that changed in 2020. A homeschool college prep program in Connecticut was sued because they expelled someone. They said that he was fighting. There is a serious question whether he was actually the aggressor or the victim, but the parents actually won the initial round because the group had said, once they found out about the fight, we will make a full and fair investigation of this. And then they didn't. Without any hearing or anything, they just kicked the kid out. And that case was settled out of court. Because of that, I don't have any details. I can guess that probably the program ended up having to pay some money. There was also a Catholic homeschool hybrid group. Regina Chaley got sued about 5 or 6 years ago by a whistleblower who claimed that his wife was fired from being a math tutor by Regina Chaley when the family started asking detailed financial questions about what was going on and who was being paid what. And again, that one was settled. There are no details. So in cases like this, let's take a look at this next slide here. Who are your group's friends in situations like this? Well, the first one is insurance. Insurance is your friend if your group gets sued, because if you get sued, insurance can pay for your defense, and it can pay out if you lose. For example, the $75,000 that the Muslim Society of Greater Danbury had to pay, that probably was paid by their insurance company. Now, to protect yourself personally and your personal assets, incorporation is your friend. Incorporation is just setting up your group as a legal entity that exists by itself. You have to register with your state, and in a number of states, there are even handy online templates at your Secretary of State's website. You can incorporate as a for-profit business, and several different kinds of that, or you could incorporate as a nonprofit. As a lawyer, I am going to strongly recommend that before you file your articles of incorporation, you should at least have a lawyer look them over. Now, I mentioned before that we're going to be talking about public accommodations. And this is an important thing to know about your group, because a lot of civil rights and anti-discrimination laws are written to apply to public accommodations. It's important in figuring out how much control, for example, you have over who is in your group. So a public accommodation, there's different definitions in every state, and then there's federal definitions, but in general, it's basically a business or an organization that's open to the public. Now, the Equality Act, which, if it ever passes through congressional gridlock, would expand this definition some, but for most homeschool co-ops, it's still not going to apply, except if you run as a business rather than a nonprofit. Chances are greater that way. So, unless you're really running a school or a business, and a lot of homeschoolers actually are, it's unlikely that you're a public accommodation because you are not open to the general public. You are not open to anyone who wants to join. But civil rights laws have been getting more expansive over the last few decades. For example, what if your homeschool group is running a convention? Do you have to make sure, for example, that you have interpreters there if a deaf homeschooler comes to at least interpret the keynote sessions? So you're offering services to the general public, like doing a convention. What about if you're selling goods to the general public? Let's say that part of your homeschool group's normal business is to run a book sale so that new homeschoolers can get curriculum. Well, that might make you a public accommodation. All right, now here's a question that I got from Iowa a couple years ago. This person wrote in and said, I recently started a homeschool group. We currently meet at our public library. After starting the group, we decided to make it a Christian group. Are we allowed by law to still meet in a public place if we are a Christian group? The library lets other groups meet there, like Girl Scouts and other local clubs and organizations. Can they legally not let us hold their meetings there anymore just because we decided to become a Christian homeschool group? So, here's the question for you here. Can the library do that? So, for those of you who say, no, that's a violation of our free exercise of religion, can I see your hands? How about those who say, probably, because the library is a public accommodation? Well, I said probably. The library is definitely a public accommodation. It's open to the general public. Their meeting room, any group could meet there. But this library had a policy like actually most libraries that I've run across. You can use their meeting rooms as long as your group does not discriminate in your membership. Now, note, this doesn't mean that the group couldn't be Christian. Absolutely, it can be Christian. It can say Christian things. It can pray beforehand. It can use Christian curriculum. What it can't do if it wants to meet in the library is say, and if you aren't Christian, you can't join our meeting. That's a problem. It just means, in this case, if you want to use the library, you have to be open to any homeschooler to join. All right, so we have talked about the child protection policy, some about finances, some about code of conduct, and now we're starting to talk about membership policies. So people ask, should we have a membership policy? And the answer is probably you should, unless you're just a really informal hanging out as homeschoolers. Here are some things you might want to consider about your particular membership policy. Who do you want in your group? We'll talk a little bit more about this. But that's a big, important part of your membership policy. What is the process for joining? And sometimes, most importantly, how do you make someone leave your group if it just isn't working? Do you have, for example, a policy about returning membership fees if someone leaves? One group contacted me after I had a dispute with a member who asked to leave and have her membership fee refunded. The problem was the group had a policy that says as long as you cancel your membership by July 31, you get your money back. And she didn't do it till about August 10 or so, about a week and a half later. And she signed a contract for the entire year. She asked for her money back, and they said no. And this kicked off an email chain that, among other things, included a demand for the contact information for the co-op's legal counsel, and ended with pretty hurtful words like, my apologies for confusing this with a friendship. I'm clear now. Paperwork and legalities come first. This was all business. Now, couple notes here. I got dragged into it because even though I wasn't the lawyer for the group, I was the lawyer that they knew dealt with homeschool issues, so I got copied and then blind copied on a lot of these emails. This was all over less than $300, and the two people fighting over email not only went to the same church, but had been in the same small group for years. Do you see why I say money brings issues? It just plain does. So again, talking about a membership policy. Who do you want in your group? What's the process for joining? If you are a private religious homeschool group, for example, which a lot of the ones I talk to are, you are allowed to use your membership policy and process to encourage the kind of homeschool families that you want in your group. For example, I was contacted by a group in Indiana a few years ago. There was a homeschool mom who wanted to join the group. They had a problem with it because on weekends, her weekend job was that she flew out to Las Vegas, where she described herself as providing adult entertainment and escort services. And the group called me and said, "We don't want her in the group. Can she sue us?" Well, A, remember, this is America. Anyone can sue you for anything. But B, she's going to find it really difficult to find a lawyer because no one has a right to join your private organization. It's your group. You can decide who joins and who doesn't. So, for example, if you want to attract a certain kind of Christian to your group, pick a statement of faith from the local Baptist church that everyone has to sign. If you want to attract only full-time homeschoolers to your group, make that a requirement for membership. Say that, this homeschool group is designed for parents teaching their kids, not those who are in some sort of hybrid program where they're away from home 3 days a week and only at home 2 days. If you want to attract unschoolers to your group, maybe have a personal interview as part of the membership process to discuss their educational philosophy and how it is child-directed and how they implement that. Now, homeschooling is legal in every state. But I've put up here, there are some other legal issues. Because just like with homeschooling, even though it's legal, you can't just start homeschooling and not do anything, depending on the state. Running a homeschool group is the same way. So as an example, homeschooling is legal everywhere. If you want to homeschool in Texas, you just start homeschooling. Yay, Texas. Also New Jersey, also Michigan, also Alaska, and a few others. If you want to homeschool here in Georgia, you have to file a notice of intent and then do an assessment every 3 years and keep that on file in case anyone needs to look at it later. In Virginia, where I live, you have to file a notice of intent every year and an assessment every year. And that's not just kept, that gets handed in to the superintendent. Unless you go with the religious exemption option in Virginia, which is, I have religious objections to ever sending my kids to public school. They will never darken the doors of a public school. Please exempt me from compulsory attendance from now on. Add a couple scripture verses, and you're done for that kid. K through 12, never reporting again. So, homeschool groups. There are lots of legal issues here. It is legal for homeschoolers to get together for classes, for events, for socialization. We have been doing it since the 1980s. I know, I was there. I was in a homeschool co-op 89 to 91. But sometimes there are other issues that come up. They tend to come up when money is involved, and they tend to come up anytime that someone else is homeschooling my child for a while. In other words, wherever you hear the words microschool, homeschool pod, hybrid, or sometimes co-op nowadays. Maybe. So, again, I've listed on this slide just some of the issues you might want to consider. For example, what's the definition of homeschool in your state? Because that can make a difference on how often your group can meet together. Does your state offer other options like very small private schools that don't require much regulation? Maybe that might be a good place to look into. Is tutoring a thing in your state law? In some states, to be a tutor, you have to be a currently certified teacher. Does your state have a definition of private school? Is your group a business? Perhaps it needs a business license. I've actually talked with groups in California who operate in 2 different counties, and one county requires them to have a business license, and one county says you don't need a business license. So that was a weird one. Are you a daycare? This is a big one. I actually recently got an email from a longtime homeschooler that said, we know a family that's being looked into because they have a group of homeschoolers meeting together in their home. And Child Protective Services got a call that they were running an illegal daycare. And I said, yes, join the club. I've talked with probably about 25 of those groups over the last few years. I just had to help a mom in Texas recently. She was homeschooling her own child, but she's also licensed to provide childcare for up to 3 other kids, and she was starting to be investigated by the daycare licensing agency for providing too much education, because that changed her from a daycare, which she was licensed for, into a preschool, which she wasn't licensed for. And the agent actually demanded to come into her home, examine her curriculum, and watch her teaching her own kid and the other kids. We said no, by the way. Other issues that might apply. How does zoning apply to your homeschool group? Are there health and safety laws that apply, like fire codes? Do you have to have a sprinkler system because you are an education group? If, God forbid, COVID distancing restrictions or masking starts coming back in style, those may apply to your group. They may not. Again, I had groups calling me from Michigan where in one county, the masking requirements in 2021 were written by someone who had no clue what was going on, and every homeschool co-op there could ignore them. And the next county over knew exactly how homeschoolers operated and wrote to make sure that no homeschool co-op was allowed to meet without those restrictions. Issues like immunization. In some states, those may apply to your group if it's a private school. In some, they won't. I do want to highlight 2 issues before we leave that groups may not think about. And the first one is about teachers. So many groups are starting to get into teacher issues without really thinking about it, because they're thinking, oh, we're just a homeschool co-op, and homeschool co-ops are totally legal, and so even though we're operating 4 days a week and we have 20 teachers, we're just a homeschool co-op. Well, here are some important things to think about if you have people who are teaching other than their own kids. In other words, most of you guys probably. Things like, are these people going to be paid or are they going to be volunteer? Well, if they are volunteer and you are running 3 days a week, those volunteers may last a couple months. I've talked with some of my Catholic homeschool friends. They said if they are nuns, you may get them to stay a full year if they're volunteer. Anyone else will burn out long before that. So most are going to have some paid staff, and then if you are paying them, are they your employees or are they independent contractors? If they are your employees and you are a religious group, you get to ask them questions like, what is your view on the Trinity? And how's your walk with Jesus Christ going? If they're independent contractors, in most states, you aren't allowed to ask those questions because you can't discriminate against contractors based on religious views. This can be an important issue, by the way. If you misclassify a teacher as, say, a contractor rather than an employee, there was a group in Pennsylvania that had to shut down because it got fined so much money that it could no longer operate. There was another one up in Chicago that had to pay $20,000 for misclassifying their teachers as independent contractors. Do you have to have unemployment insurance? Maybe there are state laws you're going to need to look at. And it'll probably depend on how many teachers do you have. Most states, if you only have 2 teachers, they aren't going to care. But in some, once you go over 3, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of unemployment paperwork you have to file. So, the last one that I want to talk about, and this one I'll just ask, have any of you heard about PMAs, private membership associations? All right, I don't see any hands, which is good. Usually this is something that comes up more in New York and California recently, but here are some of the claims of people who laud the glories of PMAs. If you operate as a PMA, there's no authority for the government to tell you what to do. For PMAs, there is no government intrusion on your life. If you're in the private domain, you are no longer under the jurisdiction of the local, state, and federal government. What this means, the PMA people say, is if you just set up as a PMA, you are not subject to daycare law, compulsory education law, zoning laws, fire code, homeowners association restrictions, unemployment laws. None of that applies to you because you're just a private membership association. which would kind of be nice if it were true, but I'm highly skeptical. Most of these arguments are based on the sovereign citizen arguments of the late 1990s, where if you use certain magical words, it took you out of the jurisdiction of the federal government, and you didn't have to pay income taxes. And some of those people went to jail because those arguments don't work very well when they get challenged. I always tell people if you're going to start up a PMA, HSLDA will not assist you, and we would recommend talking with an attorney who is familiar with PMAs. Good luck on finding such an attorney. Now, that being said, operating as a private association that has members is the way that most homeschool groups operate. That's just fine. Depending on how you set up, you may be able to exempt yourself from some education laws or disability laws, but there are a lot of things that HSLDA does help with, even though PMAs is not one of them. So I've listed some of them on this last slide here. Now, HSLDA Group Services does not generally represent groups, which means if you guys want to call, you don't have to be a member. Just call, you will get, I was going to say you'll get me, actually you'll get my assistant, and we'll set up a time to do a Zoom call or a phone call. But we help with a lot of things. There are two down at the bottom I put in red there. I don't do specific questions about incorporation and insurance beyond just the general. That's something you need to talk with a lawyer or an insurance agent. And then lastly, HSLDA does not do arbitration between members of a group or between board members of a group, even though I've had several groups put that in their bylaws that if they have a conflict, they're going to call HSLDA. Well, that's nice, but we're going to tell you we're not going to help. If you call us with a conflict about someone who is in your group, chances are decent that person may be an HSLDA member, which is one of the reasons that we don't get involved, because it could be a conflict. So then, I have, as promised, put up my email address, darren@hslda.org, my phone number. I'll be happy to send these slides to you if you'll just send me an email. Feel free to give a phone call, ask for group services. We'll get a time set up. So thank you very much. I hope that you, as homeschool entrepreneurs, find a marvelous educational and inspirational experience at Flourish. Have a wonderful day.